For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi, and on the gist today, we're looking at the NBR, the National Bureau of Asian Research report on meeting the Chinese military challenge in terms of collective responses of US allies and partners. Our guest today is the editor of the NBR report, Gill. He's professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies and head of the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at the Macquarie University in Sydney. Professor Gill, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Amitabh.
In terms of your report, I'll just go into that, probably flesh it out a little bit more. But in terms of what's really been happening of late, and it's happened just last week, it's exactly what your report is talking about in terms of, say, the Australia-Japan reciprocal access agreement. There was a US-Japan 2+2 as well. And over the last year and a little bit more, we've seen AUKUS, Quad, lots of bilaterals, trilaterals, plurilaterals, multilaterals. That's in essence what you're looking at in terms of US partners and alliances and how successful they have been in countering the Chinese military threat, right, Professor?
Well, that's right. And our interest in producing this report was to try and look across a range of American allies as well as non-allied but still security partners, either continuing or emerging, and to gauge their various views towards China's ongoing military modernization process and its increasingly proactive and even assertive behavior around its periphery. And then to ask these different country experts to address four questions. Basically, what are the capabilities that China possesses that are of greatest concern? What are some of the scenarios that these experts believe those capabilities would be most likely used? Third, what policies have been undertaken within these six countries to counteract or counterbalance those concerns, those threats coming from China? And finally, what would they suggest could be possible in cooperation with the United States and with others in the Indo-Pacific region to try and counterbalance these unwelcome advances in China's military modernization? As a result, I think we found a great deal of common ground across these six countries and the United States, but a range of differences as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Professor Gill, in terms of countering China or confronting China, containing China, constraining China, whatever the word that you choose to use, this is a process. This collective security arrangements that various countries are entering into or furthering is a process. So, how successful would you say it has been over the last year or so in terms of its objective?
Well, I think there's been pluses and minuses. I mean, I think as the report makes pretty clear, there is some strong consensus or common ground within the region about China's building military buildup and concerns about just what China's intentions may be longer term. So that's a basic common ground I think can be found across many countries in the region, not just American allies, but also other security partners. But the problem, I think, is trying to then build off of that sort of lowest common denominator consensus and determining just what exactly can be done about it. And as the report shows, there's a wide degree of divergence among these six countries discussed in the report, which is going to make building out a firm a coalition, if that's the right word, probably a bit unrealistic. But there's a great deal of work that can be done, I think, among smaller combinations of these countries, as well as through a greater degree of American engagement in the region. And the reason for these differences is obvious. I mean, each of these countries have slightly different concerns about China. They have slightly different means by which to counteract these challenges from China. And of course, some have other interests in their relationship with China, whether that be through economic interests, diplomatic interests, and the like, which might constrain a fully military response. So it's a very complicated picture. I think the purpose of this report is to try and encourage countries in the region, as well as the United States, to be thinking a lot harder about what can be done.
In fact, Professor Gill, we were just looking at the Global Times reaction to your report, the NBR report, and we had played that out. The fact that they are reacting in an editorial and what they say, what does that actually say about the report? Is it hitting them where it hurts?
Well, the report, of course, is going to be hitting some nerves in China because China does not appreciate any effort within the region which would smack of somehow coalition building or what China would call containment. In fact, I think it is clearly a part of China's strategy to divide and conquer, if possible, by driving wedges into these nascent coalitions, whether that's the quadrilateral security dialogue, or Quad as it's known, or even the bilateral American allies treaty agreements with countries like Japan or Australia. And of course, China is especially sensitive to any effort undertaken to strengthen defense and security relations between Washington and Taipei. So, any even theoretical effort to try and find greater common ground across these various countries in the region are going to send off alarm bells in Beijing. And so I think that in part explains the reaction of the Global Times to the report. It dismisses the report as actually underscoring Beijing's viewpoint that there are great differences among the different countries in the regions about what to do with China, about China, and that in China's view, that means it's going to be impossible to try and build greater common ground about counterbalancing China. I disagree with that interpretation of the report, but that's how they chose to see it.
Sure. I think it was Wang Yi who said, in terms of the Quad, that it's just foam on the sea surface that will dissipate. Well, that clearly is not the case, but there is, like you pointed out earlier, a lot of movement that is required, whether it is in the Quad or these other groupings.
Well, that's right. And in the report, we lay out a number of quite specific recommendations coming from the various experts from the 6 countries involved, which, by the way, were Australia, India, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Some of them are quite specific to the countries themselves, each of which has their own sets of interests, as I said, vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the United States. And because of that, those relationships, there are going to be somewhat different approaches amongst those bilateral relationships between the United States and those 6 countries. But there are also some recommendations there about what these different countries can do in common with one another, either in bilateral or trilateral or larger combinations. And basically, it boils down to this: greater political, diplomatic, and military engagement of the United States, greater willingness on the part of the United States to help countries in the region to develop their defensive and even warfighting capabilities in response to China. Third, there needs to be efforts undertaken to try and find some greater consensus about what to do in the region if China were to use force against Taiwan. And there are other matters we can talk about, but there are ways forward, but it's going to create, it's going to require real skill and diplomacy and commitment on the part of the United States and these other countries to move forward.
The report also looks at through the eyes or perspectives of these 6 different countries and experts, not just at China's military prowess or capabilities, but also its gray zone warfare. Because until there is an actual conflict, God willing, there won't be. That's what China is using against various countries.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I've found coming out of the study, reading the 6 experts' opinions and engaging those essays with others, government leaders from around the region, and strategic thinkers around the region, was precisely the point you've made, and that is the degree of concern among many of the countries, if not most, that we addressed in this report about so-called gray zone tactics. Not so much kinetic war fighting, but the gray zone issues. Now, there were some exceptions. Obviously, Taiwan is clearly most concerned with the possibility of kinetic conflict with China. But even there, very high degree of concern and awareness about the effort underway by China to undermine morale, to undermine preparedness in Taiwan through so-called gray zone tactics, activities short of conflict. And, I think if Beijing had its preferences, of course, they would like to settle the various territorial disputes that they have. They would like to assert Chinese interests more broadly around its periphery without having to fight, and to do so through these coercive and deterrent uses of gray zone tactics. So that, I think, explains why it was such a prominent element of the various experts' concerns when talking about what sort of capabilities and threats are emanating from China that concern them most.
When you're talking about actual conflict, on the land border, India is the only country where there has been, last year on Galwan in Ladakh, deadly clashes with the Chinese. And the experts' perspective there again looks at various scenarios when it comes to India in terms of the continuing salami-slicing tactics that we've seen with the Chinese, an all-out war along the LAC or the border, and then China-Pakistan collusion, two-front war, as we call it here in India.
Yes. Well, I think, even, the tragic events of last year on the Sino-Indian border areas, even that, arose in part because of China pressing the envelope, engaging in salami slicing and a form of gray zone tactics, which unfortunately then ultimately erupted in open, deadly combat. And this is the risk, obviously, of China engaging in these tactics, that they can unfortunately devolve into a broader, deadly confrontation, or worse. Even a larger conflagration could certainly erupt. And yet, Beijing seems prepared to keep pushing the envelope. Now, India is a large and capable country and military with experience in these sorts of activities with China. Others are not, or are less so, at least, and perhaps less prepared, and maybe even less capable of reacting and defending their sovereign interests. And so I think we should expect China to continue pressing the envelope in various ways, whether that's in the East China Sea, across the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, and yes, in the Himalayas. And countries that want to push back are going to have to come up with ways of doing so, perhaps in the gray zone themselves, but certainly building up their own deterrent, and yes, if need be, warfighting capability to try and counterbalance China's actions in these ways.
You mentioned Taiwan a few times in this discussion already. If you can flesh out what the expert there talks about in the report, looking at the worst case scenario, I mean, Taiwan will probably be, if China is going to reunify Taiwan and do it by force, that would be the first step in the first island chain. Uh, the expert looks at worst case scenarios in terms of what the Chinese would do and how Taiwan would possibly, currently, with its armaments or its policies, not really be able to hit back at a Chinese invasion in terms of, say, I mean, interesting argument there I saw about the F-16s. If the Chinese take out all the runways, what are the F-16s going to do?
Right.
They need probably F-35s, which are, short takeoff and landing.
That's right. The expert writing for on the Taiwan paper, I think, generates some of the most controversial and heated discussions over the course of the project, because indeed his scenario is one in which China will quickly overwhelm Taiwan defenses, and his critique being most pointedly that where Taiwan is spending most of its money, for example, in these very high-end jet aircraft, fighter aircraft platforms, will be rather quickly rendered inoperable in his view. And so, therefore, his argument being that a quite different strategy needs to be undertaken. He's not alone in this view. There are many in other parts of the region, as well as in the United States, who believe Taiwan needs to rethink how it's going to defend itself against what is increasingly overwhelming capabilities in many respects by China, not just in terms of their ability to attack and defeat Taiwan militarily in a kinetic conflict, but also, of course, to deter or dissuade intervention from other countries. Maybe that's the United States, maybe that's Japan, others. And there are many, many ways that can be done, but Taiwan at the moment does not seem yet fully seized of this need in this author's view and the view of others to take a different approach, to become far more lethal in their ability to deter and dissuade a Chinese attack.
You talked about differences within these countries, even though the prime objective here is, again, to counter or counterbalance China. It does find mention in the India part of the perspective in terms of CAATSA. I mean, the US imposing CAATSA, if they do, that is against India, for buying the S-400 air defense missile system from the Russians. Now, if the prime objective is to counter China, how do you reconcile, these different strands? America.
Again, yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, this was a matter of, again, some heated debate and discussion. I think among those who we gathered around the table and conversed with regard to this very question, these were not serving government officials, but nevertheless people who have some influence in their opinions in Washington. I think the consensus there was that it would be a mistake to impose sanctions on India, but that some other sort of arrangement or understanding needs to be reached, obviously. And I don't know what the outcome ultimately of those decisions will be by the Biden administration, but I do believe that there are some restraining voices clearly on this question, precisely for the reasons you've noted, because there is this gathering consensus in Washington of the need to try and find more common ground in cooperation and collaboration with partners in the region, like India and others, so that a somewhat more countervailing coalition of like-minded concerned countries in the region can be formed vis-a-vis China.
Professor Bates Gill, thank you so much for sharing the NPR report that you edited, your experience and the perspective of the authors in that report, as well as your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours. And just a reminder to our viewers, do send us your feedback about this particular interview and the report. If you have any, do put in your comments on YouTube. Follow and like this video, and send the link if you want to both your personal and professional contacts, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.